few yeses, so we'll use it for those of you who say yes. If I can figure out how to turn it on. Testing? Testing? No? Hi. There we go. All right. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you to the San Diego Library for hosting me. This is quite possibly the most beautiful library I have ever presented in. Yes, of course. Very cool. I heard it's brand new. Very cool for you guys. I'm Marissa Meyer. I'm the author of Cinder, Scarlet, and Cress, which just came out a few days ago. They are the first 3 books of the Lunar Chronicles. So I'm going to start a little bit by talking about the books, for those of you who may not have read them or be familiar with them yet. And then we will talk about kind of my path as a writer and getting the idea for the books. I'm going to talk a little bit about NaNoWriMo, for those of you who may be writers in the audience. And then I'm going to wrap it up by talking about one of my personal favorite topics, which is fairy tales, but not the Disney stories of many of our childhoods. And at the end, we'll have time for Q&A as well. So, the Lunar Chronicles, these are my first novels. They are all futuristic retellings of some of your classic fairy tales. So, the first book in the series, Cinder, is based on Cinderella, but it's set in futuristic China in a city called New Beijing. And it tells the story of Cinder, who is a 16-year-old girl who is part human and part machine, making her what's called a cyborg. Unfortunately for Cinder, she lives in a world in which cyborgs are pretty much considered second-class citizens. They don't have any rights or freedoms. They're essentially considered the property of their guardian. And so Cinder is living in this household with her stepmother, who is not at all happy to have this cyborg in her care. However, being cyborg has also given Cinder an amazing skill. She is this great mechanic. She can fix pretty much anything. So at the start of the book, she had opened up a booth at the weekly market, and people would bring her hover cars and androids, and she would fix them, and that's how she earned her keep with her stepmother. Well, one day, that reputation of being the best mechanic in her city brought the prince of her country to her booth, needing her to fix a broken android. And it turned out that android had a really big secret. So from there, Cinder was kind of launched into this world of royalty and politics, and it put her on a collision course with Queen Lavana, who is the queen of the Lunars. In the world of the Lunar Chronicles, there is a society of people who live on the moon. Over time, they have evolved to have powers of mind control and mind manipulation. And this evil queen that is ruling them is now determined to find a way to rule Earth. As the series goes on, Cinder comes to determine that she may be the only one capable of stopping her. Book 2 of the series, Scarlet, continues Cinder's story. Cinder is really the main character of all 4 books. But in it, we also met Scarlet, who is my rendition of Little Red Riding Hood, who was a delivery spaceship pilot, dead set on finding her grandmother, who had mysteriously disappeared. And she was doing that with the help of a city street fighter who goes by Wolf. As we all know from the fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood, Wolf was a totally trustworthy guy. So I am one of those writers where I always wanted to be a writer. I knew from a really, really young age this is what I wanted to be doing. I was an avid reader. I loved books. I always had this crazy overactive imagination. I was that kid that would sit in the back of the classroom talking to myself. You were that kid? Yeah. I just had all these stories in my head, and it was really difficult for me to turn them off. But eventually I found that I could kind of channel that energy by writing these stories down. So that's what I did, and it kind of helped me focus and sleep at night, which sounds weird, but it's true. Also, and then at one point I made a connection that behind every one of these books that I loved so much was a real human being, and that person got to come up with that story and write those characters, and that somebody paid them to do it. Like, that is the best job ever, and I had this vision of myself, and I would be like working my pajamas all day and making stuff up, and the checks would just roll in. I thought, this is the life for me. So I always had this dream of being a writer. But growing up, I was kind of very scattered. I'd write poetry here, and maybe I'd write a script or a play, and I'd write maybe a short story. I didn't have much focus until I was a teenager. And what happened when I was a teenager is that my best friend introduced me to this really awesome TV show called Sailor Moon. Okay, I heard one. There's always one in the audience. Yes! Go Moonies! Raise your hand if you're familiar with Sailor Moon. Okay, most of you. Awesome. I presented some high schoolers today, and there were like 3 people. I'm like, oh, generation, they don't know. So if you did not raise your hand, Sailor Moon was a Japanese anime, super popular in the 90s. And it was about these 5, I'm just turning wait, it's coming back now. It was about these 5 teenage girls who one day, a talking cat shows up in their lives, and this talking cat tells them that they are in fact reincarnated royalty from outer space. Because why not? And the cat gives them all wands that turns them into superheroes, and they get to run around fighting monsters and saving the world. And they get to do it wearing these super cute little Sailor Moon outfits. And then there's also a guy. Who's the guy? Sailor Moon. He got to fight monsters in a tuxedo. Guys, come on, what would you fight monsters in? It's totally practical. Anyway, so I started watching this show when I was 14. I thought it was the best thing I had ever seen. I completely fell in love with it. And I got really inspired to write stories about these characters. And so that's what I started to do. I did not know it at first, but this is a thing called fan fiction. When you take an existing story, it could be from a book or a movie or a TV show, and you write your own stories using that world and those characters. And then, thanks to the power of the internet, I discovered that I was not the only person writing these stories. It turned out there were entire archives online where other fans were also writing stories about these characters and posting them, and the whole community could read them and enjoy them. Well, this was brand new for me. Up till this point, everything that I had ever written was very secretive, and, I didn't want to share it with anybody. I was like, I don't want anybody to even know that I want to be a writer. But when I discovered this world of fan fiction and this really awesome supportive community, it just made me want to share my work more and get more feedback, and the more I did it, the more I wanted to keep doing it. So all through high school, all through college, I was working on these stories. Well, then one day, when I was, how old was I? I would be like 25, I think. I heard about a writing contest that was happening on a Sailor Moon website. And the girl who was hosting the contest had made a list of 10 things. And in order to enter, you had to choose 2 things from her list and include them in a short story. So I took a look at her list, and the first thing that I chose that I wanted to include in my story was I wanted to include a fairy tale character. I am rather obsessed with fairy tales, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. So I thought, why not? We'll do fairy tales. The other thing that I chose from her list was that I was going to set my story in the future. I had never written science fiction before. I had never thought thought that I wanted to write science fiction, but I grew up loving Star Wars, and so I thought, why not? That'll be a really fun challenge. And I ended up, I started thinking about it, and I was like, well, what do Sailor Moon and fairy tales have in common? And it occurred to me, they both have talking cats. So I decided to retell the story of Puss in Boots, which, if anybody remembers, was the fairy tale about the cat that was very nice boots. And I wrote this kind of sci-fi retelling of it. It's set in the world of Sailor Moon, and there was a robotic talking cat, and there were people who lived on the moon. And I wrote this story, and it was so much fun to write. I got a huge kick out of it. I thought, this is a great idea, combining fairy tales and science fiction. So I was really, really excited about it. I submitted my contest entry to the contest, and a couple weeks went by, and I came to learn that my story was one of only 2 stories that were entered into the contest. I came in 2nd place. But not to be deterred, by that point I was so in love with this idea that I was already starting to think, well, what if I were to write an entire series of science fiction fairy tale retellings? And so I had this idea mulling around in my head. The first thing I did after I got this idea was I made a list of my own personal favorite fairy tales. And I was just brainstorming, what if I did this? What if I did this? What if Sleeping Beauty was stuck in a cryogenic sleeping chamber? What if Rumpelstiltskin was an evil android? All these are crazy ideas. So that kind of was going on in my head for a few months. And then one night, as I was falling asleep, I had a dream about Cinderella. And in this dream, she was your totally typical Cinderella, right? She's wearing her big poofy ball gown, she's running away from the palace because the clock is about to strike midnight, and she tripped on the palace steps. But in this dream, instead of a glass slipper falling off, her whole foot fell off. And I snapped awake and I thought, her foot fell off because she's a cyborg. Which seemed to make sense. I don't know how many people like that's the conclusion that they draw from that. But that's where my brain went with it, and I thought her foot is actually a robotic foot, and that's why it fell off. And I got out of bed and I immediately started writing notes to myself about who this girl was, why is she a cyborg, what is this world like that she's living in? And by this point I had already kind of brainstormed so many other ideas for the other fairy tales that I was already starting to get a concept in mind about this world in which there's this lunar society that is trying to take over Earth, and there's this evil queen. And when I had that idea for that cyborg Cinderella, it was kind of like the missing puzzle piece that I needed to start bringing all of these other crazy random ideas together. And I could very quickly see that this would be a story that was going to encompass multiple fairy tales, but at the heart of it would be this battle between this cyborg Cinderella and the Wicked Queen, who was inspired by the Wicked Queen from Snow White. So that was kind of the seed for the idea that eventually evolved into the Lunar Chronicles. Well, this was back in August of 2008, which means it was a few months before November, which happens to be National Novel Writing Month. Any NaNoWriMo computers in the audience? A few of you, awesome. If you're not familiar, NaNoWriMo is a thing that happens every November. It was started by this group of friends in San Francisco about 15 or 20 years ago, and one day these friends got together and they decided to challenge each other to each write a 50,000-word novel during a single month. They did it one year. The next year they decided to do it again. A few more people joined in. The year after that they did it again. Had a few more people join in. Last year, over 350,000 people competed all over the world, trying to write their 50,000-word novels during the month of November. So it's turned into this big, kind of huge international phenomenon. If you're an aspiring writer and you need the added motivation, I think it's a great tool to get you started. So back in 2008, it was August, I had a few months to go. I had done NaNoWriMo twice. Both times I had successfully completed my 50,000 words, so I felt really good about it. I was like, I am capable of accomplishing this. Plus, I have this idea for this cyborg Cinderella story that I'm so excited for. But then I heard about another writing contest. This contest was being hosted by someone up in Seattle, which is where I'm from, and they had somehow gotten teamed up with a director of an upcoming season of Star Trek. And they were having this contest, but the Seattle area writer who wrote the most words that November was going to walk on role in an episode of Star Trek. You feel me, you get it.
If you're not quite sure why this would be a big deal to me, let me explain to you a little bit about my background and where I'm coming from. I happen to come from a very proud family of nerds. The biggest nerd in my family is my Uncle Bob, who is awesome, and he is such a big Trekkie, all capitals Trekkie. And Uncle Bob, he is such a big Trekkie that he has converted the attic of his house to resemble the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. He has a captain's chair and everything. I'm telling you, my Uncle Bob is awesome. On top of that, when I was a kid, Bob used to take me and my brother to whenever the midnight opening showings of the new movies would come out. And in my family, we do this sort of thing in costume. So I have this picture. You're not going to be able to see it from out there, but it'll be on the signing table later. That's me and Uncle Bob. I'm an 8-year-old Klingon. So that's my family. So when I heard about this contest that I could be on Star Trek, I was like, oh, this must happen. Like, I would be the coolest person in my family. So I was determined to win this contest. I had a few months to prepare. And I used those months very wisely. I researched as much for the books as I possibly could ahead of time. I wrote outlines. I knew it was going to be a 4-book series by this point. So I outlined every book in the series. I wrote character profiles. I gathered inspiration photos, setting profiles, everything I could do to prepare myself. I was on top of it. And I set myself a goal. I figured that to have a really good chance at winning, I would have to write not 50,000 words, but 150,000 words. So that was my goal, and I had a little worksheet of how many words I would have to write every day, etc., etc. I feel like I should probably point out I was working full-time. I was also taking 2 classes toward a master's degree. In hindsight, it's such a bad idea. What was I thinking? I was thinking I was going to go Star Trek.
So November 1st arrived, and I wrote my little heart out. Every spare minute I could, I was getting up early in the mornings to write. I was writing on my bus commutes during my lunch breaks when I got home after work on weekends. Every spare minute I could, I was working on these novels. So November 30th rolls around, and about 9 o'clock in the evening, I submitted what I had done to the NaNoWriMo website. And they had a little word counter on there, and it told me that I had written 150,011 words. And I was so pleased that I had hit my goal. I was so ecstatic.
published. I sent it to about a dozen agents. 2 months later, I signed with the very first agent that I had sent it to. She and I worked on the submission package for about 2 weeks. She sent it to publishers on a Friday, and we had an offer to publish the books the following Monday. So it happened very, very quickly. My favorite part of that story is that offer to publish them came in on November 1st, 2010. So exactly 2 years after I started writing it. So obviously, like, the heavens were opening up and there were angels and choirs and all that good stuff. It felt very meant to be. So that, of course, did eventually become Cinder and my first published novel. Which is today. But I know at this point you're all like, okay, you wrote a book. Did you get to be on Star Trek? Unfortunately, I did not win the contest. I came in, I came in third place. The worst part was that I was only like 1,000 words behind the first place winner, and I turned it in at 9 o'clock. I had 3 more hours. I could have done it. So that really, really broke my heart for about 4 years until I found out that they never ended up making the Star Trek season at all. So I was like, oh well. I got a book published out of the deal. I'm still the coolest person in my family. And that's the end of that story. Thank you.
I love fairy tales. Let's call it an obsession. It's pretty much an obsession. My fascination with fairy tales started when I was 5 years old, and I was taken to see my very first movie in theaters, which was The Little Mermaid. Disney's The Little Mermaid. Love it. And of course, I was completely smitten. I thought it was the best thing I had ever seen. And I would always, pretend to be a mermaid like we all do. Well, a few months after I saw the movie, my grandma gave me a little book of fairy tales. And the first story in that book was The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. People who are laughing, they know where this story is going. If you have not read the original story of Little Mermaid, it is nothing like the Disney movie. It is actually a very sad, tragic story. So, of course, at 5, I was devastated. I was like, this is horrible, how can they do this to us? But once I got over it and recovered, I became really, really curious to know, more about these old stories and to know, okay, well, what else is Disney not telling us about these classic stories? And that is a curiosity that has kind of continued to this day. And so with that as an introduction, I would now like to tell you all one of the original fairy tales. And because I now have 3 fairy tale related books out based on Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, or Rapunzel, I can tell you any one of those 3 stories. So I'll let you guys vote. Who wants to hear Cinderella? Little Red Riding Hood. Okay, Rapunzel wins. Everyone's like, don't ask too many questions. We want another fairy tale. Okay, let me get a drink of water. Once upon a time, there was a poor man and his wife. And after many years of longing to have a child, they finally discovered that the wife was pregnant. And they rejoiced and they were so thrilled and delighted that as the pregnancy continued, the wife, as many pregnant women do, started to have the most intense food cravings. In particular, she was dying for this very special kind of salad green called Rapunzel. Unfortunately, the only place where Rapunzel grew in their small town happened to be in the witch's garden. So one day, the husband climbed over the wall into the witch's garden, and he gathered up as much Rapunzel as he could, and he was just about to make his escape when the witch caught him. And the witch said, I will let you take this Rapunzel back to your pregnant wife if, when she gives birth, you give the child to me. And he said, "That is the worst deal I have ever heard in my entire life. Who would trade their unborn child for a sack of lettuce? You've got to be kidding me." And the witch said, "Or I could just kill you." And he thought, "Okay, you can have the kid." And so she let him take the Rapunzel back to his wife, and she had the most delicious salad she had ever had in her life, and her food cravings were satiated, and a little while later, she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. They gave the baby to the witch in payment for the lettuce. The witch named her Rapunzel, after the lettuce, and decided to raise her as her own daughter. Well, things were going well. The witch loved her darling Rapunzel very, very much. But as Rapunzel got older, she also became more and more beautiful.
And it occurred to the witch one day that if this continued, someday one of those vile men creatures was going to want to take her Rapunzel
Away from her.
So the witch did, let's face it, what any practical mother would do. She had a tower built in the middle of the forest, and that tower had no doors and no stairs, and she stuck Rapunzel on the top. When she wanted to visit, the witch would come to the base of the tower, and she would sing out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair, that I might climb the golden stair." And Rapunzel would let down her long, flowing locks of hair, and the witch would climb up. Well, it came to pass that one day a prince happened to be meandering aimlessly through the forest. You read many fairy tales, you know this is pretty much what princes do. And as the prince was wondering, what should he hear but the most beautiful singing? And he followed the sound to the base of the tower, and he didn't get up. So after a while, he decided to hide behind some bushes and wait. Eventually, the witch showed up, and the witch sang her song, and Rapunzel let down her hair. They visited for a while, and eventually the witch left. And the prince, too, came out of hiding, and he, too, sang up the song, and Rapunzel let down her hair, and the prince climbed up, and they met in the instant moon. So the prince continued to come back visiting his Rapunzel. Some of you may be wondering, why didn't he bring a ladder? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. He should have brought a ladder. But he didn't. So a few months go by, and one day the witch was visiting her dear, sweet, innocent Rapunzel. And she looked at Rapunzel and she noticed something strange. She saw that Rapunzel was growing larger, because Rapunzel was a child. And it occurred to the witch that that meant she is being visited by one of those vile men creatures. That's what happened. And the witch became furious, and she said, "I thought that I had kept you from the whole world, and still you have deceived me." In her anger, she chopped up Rapunzel's hair, and she cast her out into a great desert. And then she waited, and eventually the prince showed up, and the prince sang up the song, and the witch let down Rapunzel's hair, and the prince climbed up. But of course, it was the witch waiting for him at the top of the tower. She said, "You are a vile, wicked man, and you will never see your Rapunzel again." The witch pushed the prince out of the tower, and he fell down to where bramble bushes had grown up around the tower's base, and two of the thorns jabbed out his eyes.
Yeah. That doesn't happen in Tangled. And the poor prince was left
To wander blindly as a poor beggar, and he wandered for many years, until one day, what should the prince hear but the most beautiful singing? He followed the sound to where Rapunzel was singing a lullaby to the twins that she had since given birth to. Rapunzel saw the poor blind beggar, and she immediately recognized him as the prince that she had so dearly loved. Rapunzel fell over the prince, and she began to
What happened to the witch?
What happened to the witch? There were people ask that. I have no idea what happened to the witch. Which is odd. In most fairy tales, most of the old ones, the bad guy gets the comeuppance. So Rapunzel's kind of odd in that regard. And somebody was telling me earlier after I told this story, before, that I guess there is a version in which as the prince is falling out of the tower, he grabs the witch and falls down with her, and that she falls to the brambles first, and they kill her, but they only get his eyes. So I guess that's a version, but that's not what the Grimm brothers told. But in most of the versions, like in Snow White, for example, at the end of Snow White, as Snow White and the prince are getting married, he also meandered meandered aimlessly through forests, you might recall. In that version, the evil queen does show up at the wedding, and in retribution for trying to kill Snow White so many times, they put a pair of iron shoes into the fire until they're glowing red hot, and they strap them onto the witch's feet and make her dance until she falls down dead. So in most of old fairy tales, the witch or the villain does get comeuppance, but Rapunzel's kind of weird in that regard. She just kind of fades away.
So if the thorns poke out his eyes, then wouldn't he, like, bleed to death?
That was a very smart question. I would assume that he was able to bandage them up somehow before he bled to death.
So this is a question not related to
Let's take apart the fairy tale some more.
What's the craziest or coolest thing a fan has done to you, or for you?
The craziest or coolest thing a fan has done, golly, I think for me one of the craziest fan moments, I mean you get those moments like where I'm at a signing and someone is like, can I take a picture with you? And they're like so excited, they're shaking. Like, that's really weird to me. Like, I'm a nice person, don't be scared. But I think for me the coolest moment, I was at a librarian conference in Texas here about a year ago, and they were doing this like speed dating with authors thing. So they had a bunch of tables. Every table had 10 librarians, and then authors would move from table to table. So I arrived at my second table of the day, and I sat down, and one of the librarians had brought her 11-year-old daughter. And I sat down next to this girl, and she looked at me, looked at my name tag, looked at me again, and then kind of fell over and gave me this enormous hug. And I was at first like, what do I do? And then when she pulled away, she was crying so hard, just because the books had had such an impact on her. She's a really big fan, and that was really touching. That was a really, really cool moment. Any more questions? Yeah.
When you're writing, you said you write an outline. Then do you just start at the beginning? Now, since you're retelling a story, you know which way it's going to go? Or do you kind of write in little, I like this, and I like this, and I like this, like they're islands, and then I write them together? Or what technique do you use? And my second part is, did you ever hear back from the national novelists? You never heard a word from your submission to the NaNoWriMo?
I'll answer the NaNoWriMo question first. The way that NaNoWriMo works, because you're all in competition with yourself, it's not a competition with other people, you don't hear anything back. If you submit your words and you did in fact write more than 50,000, which is the goal, then you get like a little badge that you can put on your website and that sort of thing. But it's not like a competition that they're giving prizes for or anything. And then as far as my technique, the question was, after I have created my outline, which I'm an outline writer, so I always start with an outline, and then from there, do I write from beginning to end, or do I kind of jump around? And it varies. When I wrote Cinder and Scarlet, I was very lineal. I pretty much started from the beginning, would work to the end, and I would do that for every draft. But with Cress, and now with Winter, which I'm currently working on, I've been much more jumping around, and part of that is because at this point in the story there's so many subplots happening that it's a lot of times easier for me to focus on one subplot. And so I'll write this character's story for 5 or 6 chapters ahead, even though that's going to be interspersed with other subplots, and then I'll work on this one and this one. And then also, sometimes if I'm, trying to write really quickly, and it's like, oh, I really don't think I have it in me to do, an action scene today. I'm going to skip ahead to this romance scene that I'm really excited for. So I'll do that sometimes too, just to kind of keep up momentum. But it varies.
As a school librarian, first I want to thank you for giving us books with such strong female characters. But from what you just said about the fairy tales, talking about these princes that just sort of wander aimlessly, is that an influence on why Kai is such a passive character? I thought it was a nice switch from, usually it's the princess sitting around doing nothing, and he's kind of just waiting for things. So.
Yeah. So the question was, my series has very kind of strong female protagonists, and when, obviously these old stories are such an inspiration for me, and the princes just kind of wander aimlessly through the forest, and if that was an inspiration for Kai, and him being such a kind of passive character. Not necessarily. I think I wanted to make Kai, one, very, very honorable, and two, I wanted him to be torn very much between, his feelings for Cinder, and his need to take care of his country, which he has now become the ruler of. And so his passiveness, I think, is brought on not because he is a passive person, because he's been put into this role in which he really doesn't have any other choices. And Kai is really one of the characters in the book that I have the most sympathy for, because while all of the other characters get to go out and try to do something, he is stuck here in New Beijing, and he is stuck facing off against the Queen day after day after day. And he's the one trying to hold it all together, and he doesn't get to go have that adventure and be the brave one. I think that if he wasn't forced in that role, that he would be. How much do I write a day? It completely varies based on where I am in the process of the book, and also kind of what's happening as far as promotion and publicity go. Because this book, Cress, just came out a couple days ago, this last few weeks have been very, very promotion and marketing centered, and now I'm going to be on tour for 3 weeks, so I'm not getting a whole bunch of writing done right now. When I'm at home and I have some time to breathe, if I'm in the early drafting stages, I can pretty much write all day, 6 to 10 hours usually. When I get into revisions, which take much, much, much longer, those are much more draining for me, so when I'm in revisions, maybe 3 or 4 hours a day.
When you create your characters, do you allow the story to develop characters for you, or do you create the character and their traits fully before you get into the story?
Do you ever hear the question? We're going to say that's a yes. It's a little bit of both. Some of the characters, I have a really clear idea in my head before I start writing them. Cinder was one of those characters I knew pretty much who she was from that first dream that I had of her. I just felt her very clearly. Some of the characters, I have an idea of who I want them to be, but then as I start writing it, they are like, I don't want to be that. I want to be this other person. And so then I kind of usually try to let them become whatever they want to be. Eco was one of those. Eco is a fan favorite. She's the android, Cinder's best friend android. When I was coming up with the concept and I wanted Cinder to have this android best friend, I had seen Eco as being very, very computerized, very logical, kind of C-3PO-ish. And then I started writing it, and the first chapter, Eco rolls into the scene, and she's all like, I want to wear a dress and go to the ball and dance with the prince, and he's cute. And she completely blew me away. I did not expect that from her at all, but I just kind of went with it, because I'm like, this is cool. And now, of course, she's the fan favorite of the whole series. So it varies a little bit.
Personality-wise, which character do you most relate yourself to?
I definitely relate most to Cress. Not that I'm a computer hacker, I wish. But Cress, is, she's totally a daydreamer, which I have, and she has this overactive imagination, just like I do, and she also tends to be very optimistic and think the best of people, which can be at times very naive. And I think that people who know me would say that I kind of share those characteristics as well. The question was, how did I come up with the plot, and how did I come up with so much stuff to be able to fill 4 entire books? That is a great question. When I was first had this idea of doing this series of futuristic fairy tales, and like I talked about how I made that list of some of my favorite fairy tales and was brainstorming different ideas. And the 4 fairy tales that I ended up settling on were kind of the 4 that just kept rising to the top and that I felt like I had the best ideas for. And the more that I was kind of looking at these 4 stories, originally I'd expected them all to be standalone books that would be set in the same world but not necessarily tied together. But as I was looking at these and I saw this evil queen character who was kind of starting to tyrannize like everybody in the whole series, and that kind of started to merge everything together into one continuous story. So it was very kind of an organic process. It's not really what I set out to do, but it started to become that very early on. Of course, the great thing about retelling fairy tales, or doing any sort of retelling, mythology or whatever, is that you already kind of have this plot in place that gives you, the very basic outline of the story, and then you can kind of expand on it from there. What author influenced me the most? That's a good question. I don't know that I really have just one. Obviously, as I said, I was a huge reader. I was a big Tolkien fan growing up. He was kind of the first. The Lord of the Rings were the first books that I read that were set in a completely made-up world, and I was like, you can do that? So that was really influential. The Giver by Lois Lowry, I read, it's amazing, isn't it? I read that in 5th grade, and if you haven't read it, go read it, it's brilliant, it's a short book. And there's this piece of information that you're given like halfway through the book that completely changes your perception of the entire world and makes you start questioning everything you know about the book and the world that they're living in. And that one line, that one sentence was so huge. And that kind of, as an aspiring writer, I was like, wow, that's really cool. That was such a small thing. You can change the reader's entire perception. So that was a really big moment for me too, reading The Giver.
It's for someone who was too shy to raise his hand.
Don't be too shy.
How do you deal with
nice,
Have you ever had writer's block, and if so, how would you deal with it?
Have I ever had writer's block, and if so, how do I deal with it? Number one, I never ever say that I have writer's block. I think that it's very psychological, this idea of writer's block, and that I think that as soon as you start saying you have writer's block, then, oh, bam, look at that, you can't write, because you're telling yourself that you can't write. I think that's unhelpful. Obviously, there are good writing days and there are bad writing days. On those bad days, if I'm really stuck or I can't figure it out, there's a lot of different techniques that I'll use. Sometimes going for a walk helps. Sometimes brainstorming. I do hand brainstorming on pen and paper a lot. I write a lot of lists to myself and just start being like, what if this happened? What if this character showed up right now? What if this character tripped and fell in a hole? I mean, just kind of completely random things. And I find that if I write down enough completely random things, eventually I'll land on something that's like, oh yes, that's perfect, that's what I need to happen next. Another one of my favorite techniques for the bad writing days is that I will give myself like really, really, really easy goals. Like for example, today I am going to write a sentence. And I know that no matter how stuck I am, I know that I am capable of writing one sentence. And 9 times out of 10, I will write that sentence, and it turns into a second sentence. And then there's a paragraph, and pretty soon there's a page. And so you're making forward progress. And you know what? If you write that sentence and you're like, that was exhausting, I am so done, then maybe it's a day that you just need to step back and take a break. The most enjoyable part of writing these books, the kissing scenes. I really love spending time with the characters. I think, kind of one of my biggest influences was Firefly. Any Firefly fans? Brown coats? Okay, if you're not familiar, it was a sci-fi show that only aired for one season. Cry. And in this show, it was about this group of smugglers that were all stuck on a spaceship together, and they were all completely unique, interesting characters. And just seeing the way they interacted with each other was like the best highlight of that show for me. So with these books, that's kind of one of the things for me too, is that now I have this, especially getting into the later books, now I have all of these characters to play with, and I just love throwing them into rooms together and putting them in situations and seeing how they deal with it. I get a big kick out of kind of the different interactions the different characters have.
What was your favorite part about writing Winter and Cress? And mostly Winter. Did you have any scenes that were really hard to get out and really emotional about?
Winter is such a tricky novel, because on one hand, this book is probably going to kill me. I still have 5 chapters left. I'm working on the 3rd draft now, and it's so close to done, and yet still feels so far away. So it's definitely been the most difficult book of the whole series, in part because there's just so much going on, so many different characters and subplots, and trying to give everybody their due and trying to resolve things that are going to be satisfying has been a really big challenge, which I love. I mean, that's part of what I like about writing, but it's also like, God, this is hard. But as far as my favorite things about writing Winter, this is also the book, I've had so many scenes in my head for, over 5 years now. And so finally I get to this big epic book, and there's so many great big scenes that I've just been so excited to write, that I'm really excited to share with readers. And so getting to those scenes has been really fun. And finally I get to actually write this scene that's been plaguing me for so long. Do I think my books will be turned into movies, and if so, who will play the characters? I certainly hope so. I would love to see these turned into movies. I can tell you that rights to the books have sold to a Hollywood studio, and at this point, I believe they have a script written, and they are trying to attach a director. So bad, but there's still a lot of hoops that have to be jumped through. It's by no means a sure thing, but there's progress being made, so my fingers are crossed. You know what I really get excited about? Action figures. What would that be? Yeah, that's what I really want. As far as who would play the characters, I don't really have too many people in mind. People will send me fan castings, and sometimes I think those are pretty cool, but for the most part I see my characters as kind of their own people, that I don't usually attach real actors to them. But one of my favorite fan castings is Emma Stone for Scarlet. I think she's pretty spunky, she could do it. And somebody just sent me a really great Kai. Who was that? I don't remember. I'm not going to remember his name. It was a really good one. He was really cute. Yeah, but I don't have a whole lot in mind. Anybody? Kristen Stewart. One request. Kristen Stewart. 2 more questions. Yes, so after the Lunar Chronicles is finished, my first book to follow will be a standalone fantasy novel called Heartless. It will be out in the fall of 2015. It is a prequel to Alice in Wonderland, telling the story of the Queen of Hearts. Yeah, I know. I'm excited. I'm really excited about that one. It has no technology in it at all. Like, it's Wonderland. I can do anything.
Why young adult fiction?
Why young adult fiction? In part because this is just what I was writing. So I started trying to write my first novel when I was 16. It was about a 16-year-old princess. And as I grew older, my characters did not. I am still writing about 16-year-old princesses. So it's kind of just how it worked and how it fit. But I think that I am drawn to this age group and this genre, in part because we're always rooting for the underdog. Teenagers don't have a whole lot of control over their lives. They're told to go to school, they're told to do their homework, they don't have cars, they don't have jobs, that's kind of, they're stuck doing what everyone else tells them to do. And I love the idea of taking someone like that and giving them the control and the power and letting them go off into the world and save the world. I think that's a really cool idea, and I think that age group, you're still optimistic enough that you believe that you can make that difference. I think as we get older, we become more pessimistic, and you don't have that. You're like, I have to stay here and pay bills. I can't go start a revolution. So I think that's part of the reason why it calls to me.